Good afternoon and most welcome to 1064. Now we finally got some nice weather here in Hising Island outside Gothenburg. The sun is shining and I will continue with Stephen M Rosen's fantastic text. Hope there are not too many disturbances here. Making paradox of a concrete reality. I hasten to admit that the foregoing words about the Kleinian embodiment of ontological paradox may themselves seem rather disembodied. What can we do to make them more concrete? Why, as a first step, let me acknowledge that until now I implicitly have been assuming the very classical posture I have explicitly sought to question. As noted above, in the classical situation of object before subject, only the object is open to view. The subject remains detached, out of reach, anonymous, and this is essentially how I have approached the object of central concern in this essay versus wholeness. In maintaining my own anonymity, in failing to situate myself in this text as the subject before whom wholeness is cast, I have let it appear as a free-floating abstraction. Then it seems that if I'm truly to challenge the classical stance, I must make wholeness less before this subject. Less remote, by recognizing in explicit terms that rather than standing before some anonymous subject, it stands before this subject. That is to say, wholeness is the content of this text. It appears before me, the one who writes these words, and before you who reads them. To be sure, I'm stating the obvious, but it is precisely the obvious that we lose sight of when we are lost in abstraction. Thus brought down to earth, the question of realizing wholeness, of embodying ontological paradox through the Klein bottle, becomes one of whether this text we are working with, being Kleining in character, can lead us back into the pre-reflected ground from which this reflection of ours originate, and can do so without a break, thereby surmounting the exclusive rule of reflection. The classical text operates squarely within the reflective mode and raises no question about doing so. Here the word or sign whose signifier serves as a surrogate for the subject refers solely to what is other, making this signified object of reflection explicit, a well-bounded content closed into its context. The signified subject per se remains implicit. It does not meaningfully refer to itself. Is classical reflection effectively challenged in modernist or postmodernist deconstructionist writing? I suggest it's not. It is true that modernist sign is self-referential. In modernism, attention is withdrawn from the end products of reflection, and meaning is relocated in an abstraction of the process itself. We see this in intensely self-involved psychological works such as James Joyce's Ulysses. In fact, we may say that modernism as such is psychological. It seems to apply logos to the psyche, i.e. to gain explicit knowledge of subjectivity. Here the sign is turned back upon itself so as to bring the light what formerly had been strictly implicit. In the language of psychoanalysis, that exemplar of modernism, the goal is to make the unconscious conscious. Stated more essentially, modernism wants to turn the classical subject into an object. In carrying out its program, does modernism genuinely surpass classicism? What actually happens is that classicism is preserved at a higher level of abstraction. For, in making the old subject explicit, in rendering it well delineated content enclosed in its context, this object, near subject, implicitly must be given to, must appear before, a new higher order subject. The self-reflection of modernism is indeed akin to gazing at the reflection of one's eye in a mirror. What had been gaze of the subject now itself appears as an object gazed upon by a subject that is one step removed from the original. While Rudolf Gachet, who knows about him, is saying exactly the same thing. The important thing to recognize is that this transformation of terms leaves completely intact the classical relationship of object in space before subject. Modernism thus possesses no fundamental challenge to classicism. Modernism's self-referential sign, by turning the self into another, in fact maintains in abstraction the classical split between self and other, between the signifier and its signified object. In postmodernism, the ultimate consequence of modernism is recognized and played out. The crux of postmodernism, I suggest, is the realization that modernism's objectification of the subject is but the first term of an infinite regress. Hooray! We have seen that in modernism, the classical subject loses its privileged position as the unquestionable base of knowledge, as the transcendent, never to be viewed perspective point from which all else is viewed. Once this subject is viewed, made explicit, objectified, cast before the perspective point on a newly implied, higher order subject, no subject can securely hold its position. Having established that the classical subject can be turned into an object, the new modernist subject should be susceptible to the same fate. The objectification of that subject would bring still newer order of subjectivity with the same susceptibility, and so on, ad infinitum. And each time the subject is undermined by being made into an object, what had been object to that subject is also undermined. Ultimately then, we have neither subject nor object in any stable, abidingly meaningful form. In the parlance of postmodern literary theory, the fixed relationship between particular signifiers and their signified meanings give way to the restless, ever-shifting text. The ceaselessly self-alienated application of the sign to itself. Thus, Gayatri Spivak, echoing the outlook of Derrida, says that, quote, sign will always lead to sign, one substituting the other as signifier and signify in turn, end of quote. In Derrida's own word, knowledge must be understood as a field of free play, that is to say, a field of infinite substitutions. Spivak, 1976, page 29, in which identity fragments into sheer difference. I am proposing that the specific way this subject takes place is by a recursive process of self-referential mirroring, in which time and again the signifier subject is displaced by being made into the signified object of a newly implicit subject. Therefore, we view the self-reflection of modernism as a mirroring that maintains in abstraction the classical relation of object in space before subject. Postmodernism would then constitute an infinite repetition of this mirroring, one that maintains classical identity in such a way that, in the end, it also negates it. The field of infinite substitutions, constitutive of the postmodern text, the infinite regress of science within science within science, is reminiscence of the old Ptolemaic epicycles, when the ancient Greek notion that heavenly bodies traverse perfectly circular orbits was called into question by new observations of the planets. Instead of gracefully relinquishing the paradigm of the circle. It was perpetuated for centuries in an artificial, ultimately unconvincing form. The orbits of planets were described in terms of epicycles, complex arrangements of circles within circles that gratuitously replicate the image of the circle. Today, the challenge to the status quo appears far greater than it was in Ptolemy's time. What is now being called into question is no mere image we can reflect upon, but the reflective posture itself, that expressed in the relation of an object in space before subject. Unable to let go of this deeply ingrained habit of comportment, postmodernism carries it forward in its infinite regress of science. The sterility of this is not lost on the postmodernists. In their abstract self-reflections, there is a distinct mood of disenchantment. Yet, because the postmodern writer can find meaning nowhere else, the rule of reflection lingers on, albeit in this negative, thoroughly self-subverting manner. An alternative to postmodernism is intimated in Eugene Gendlin's expansion upon Heidegger, noted earlier. Gendlin offers us a text that reflects upon its bodily, pre-reflective source. Speaking is a special case of bodily living, says Gendlin. Our bodies perform the implicit function essential to language. Our bodies imply our linguistic meanings. Moreover, when we speak or write, the pre-linguistic source of this activity is not simply left behind. It continues to operate in the very midst of our linguistic functioning. Thus, for example, the most sophisticated details of a linguistic situation can make our bodies uncomfortable. Could we not reflect explicitly upon the pre-reflective source of our reflection? Let us attempt such an act of self-reflection here with the very words on this page. If Gendlin is correct, our reading of these words arises from our bodies, and since this pre-linguistic source goes on functioning even as our words now turn back upon it, it seems we should be able to realize that source in a bodily way, so that our words no longer appear as mere abstractions. This is what Gendlin means when he proclaims that words can say how they work. They work from the body and becoming cognizant of their own bodily underpinning. They can link back to it. As in Gently's approach, the words of the postmodern text do reflect upon themselves, but only as words. Disembodied signs ultimately devoid of meaning. Gently points us beyond postmodernism. In Gently's form of self-reflection, the text is not merely conscious of itself as text, but calls attention to the concrete pretextual process from which it originates. Only by gaining access to the pretextual, the pre-reflective, can we supersede the old trichotomy of object in space before subject and approach embodied wholeness. In Gently's terms, the pre-reflective is pre-separated, that is, it comes before, is more primordial than the divisions arising in classicism and perpetuated in modernism and postmodernism. I have to add, for those who haven't catched that yet, that the trichotomy is also the triad we mentioned earlier, the triad that Derrida opens up to a fourth corner, and I suggested to go on with a fifth corner, but more about that some other time. Yet a gap remained between our reflection upon the pre-reflective and the pre-reflective itself. And where there are gaps, there is a continual rule of reflection. I venture to propose that the Kleinian rendition of Gently's text will be needed to close that gap. First, let me emphasize that our postmodern text must be paradoxical in character. Again, what we are seeking to do is to include in this reflection of ours the pre-reflective source of our activity, the subtext, that normally is kept strictly implicit. This text is to draw back in upon itself, make reference to itself, without alienating itself, as happened with modernist and postmodern texts. In so signifying itself, our text cannot merely turn itself into an other that is cast before a newly implied, more abstract self. Does this mean that the self that is signified must be the same as the self that is doing the signifying? Yes and no. If the self in question were simply the same, our reflection would collapse into mere self-identity. As long as we're engaged in reflection, are working with the text, or writing or speaking, and not merely remaining silent, there can be no simple self-identity. How true. Yet even though the very act of or speaking and not merely remains very act of reflecting upon the self turns it into another, it is possible for this other to flow right back into the same self from which it arises, rather than appearing merely as an other cast before a new self. Thus, the self-reflection I am describing would give us neither self nor other. In the categorical sense of these terms, we would realize instead their paradoxical interpenetration. And this is what we require to supersede the supremacy of reflective predication. Signifier and signifier would be more than reciprocally interdependent in such a self-reflective text. They would be identified, utterly one, yet they also would be two. It's the singularity that doesn't exclude plurality, and thereby can point to singularity. By the virtue of the latter aspect, reflection would continue. By virtue of the former, the pre-separated, pre-reflective dimension would be brought into play. However, For the gap between reflection and pre-reflective thus to be closed, the paradoxical return of signification to itself requires a signifier that possesses sufficient dimensionality. Enter here the Klein model. Our work with this structure clearly is no exercise in pure mathematics, in which a mathematical object is signified by a definition or algebraic formula. For us, the Klein model is not merely a signified object, it's a signifier, something pointing to, one that indeed paradoxically signifies itself. It is the dimensionality of this signifier that permits us to close the gap between the reflective and the pre-reflective. Let me get back here to signify, it's most interesting. Rodolphe Gasquet spoke of the mirror, the direct mirror image nullify thinking, existence, and also non-existence. It takes away everything. It's the pure contradiction that nullifies itself. 1 plus minus 1 is 0. That is the state of modern academia, according to Ian McGilchrist, where people in a very new way, this has never ever been the case in intellectua or intelligentsia, do no longer put themselves into what they're writing. It lacks substance. And today that's called objectivity, but before that was called emotionality, subjectivity. Lousy writing. And it is lousy writing, because always in mankind, as long as we've been intellectual, we have included ourselves, the subject. Otherwise the text becomes highly emotional, nonsensical. And this new way of writing was actually termed by Heidegger as the Abderitian writing. The Abderites were a special population from Greece. I don't know more about them, but I can imagine it's quite fitting since it's Heidegger. Is also another thing, without space, the idea rather, well, not that new, it has 300-400 years when it came into birth. The idea space is something different from my thinking, what I'm saying, and what I'm doing. It is horribly dangerous. It is a division caused by Newtonian mechanics. It is the lure of the idea of that a machinery can show the path. Yale School of Literary Criticism, modern day Swedish academia, where everything is institutionalized, made automatic, made coarse, made without a human being having its finger in it. As my old friend Klasse used to say, put with a horrible verbal decoration of obtuse and all too long words. I had to quote him here. Thanks, Klasse. Without dimensionality, all text becomes obtuse, they become unclear, there is no directionality, following ludicrous rules that on top is prioritized, that Derrida showed to be a nonsensical rule, or any other of those so-called highly emotional, not shared rules, not shared by anyone else. Those are highly privatized languages, not even understood by the individual himself. And I think that's where we are today. We live in our own simulacra, and our ignorance is covered up by fancy words. Underneath this fancy word is not even supposed to be anything. If that's not tragic, I don't know. I would say it's even more. I think it is the apocalypse of humankind, and not an apocalypse instated by God. Definitely not. This is an apocalypse caused by human beings themselves. We have seen earlier that classical reflection takes place in a context not exceeding the freer exterior dimensions. This is the normal discourse today. And I have proposed that if we do not indulge ourselves in higher order extrapolations of reflective dimensionality in the fashion of modernism slash postmodernism. The fourth dimension is pre-reflective, one that engages our inwardness. Of course, this bare statement about the pre-reflective in itself is merely a reflective. The pre-reflective fourth dimension is the content of our predictions, but that abstract content is simply contained as what we reflect upon in the closed linguistic space of our discourse. From here we cannot pass smoothly to concrete pre-reflectivity itself. This limitation derives from the fact that the signifier we use to convey our four-dimensional content themselves lack sufficient dimensionality. By themselves, these words, the one-dimensional marks printed on this two-dimensional paper surface, are indeed inadequate to make a reality of ontological paradox. They are but arbitrarily devised, conventionally agreed upon tokens that refer to the content in a merely external manner. This is the obtuse, ridiculing flatness of modern thinking. The concretization of paradox I've carried out in this essay has effected an increase in the dimension of the signifier. We went from mere words of paradox, I am, not I, to its Necker cube and Möbius strip expressions. With each step, the dimensionality of the signifier increased and our expressions of paradox became more internally embodied. But we are still working with mere symbols, reflectors whose pre-reflective content in fact remained abstract, being contained within our field of reflection. Only with a higher dimensional Klein reflector can we surpass the primacy of reflection, for only the Klein bottle signifies the fourth pre-reflective dimension by signifying itself. That is the clue, according both to Rodolphe Gasquet and Stephen M Rosen, and I bet you Heidegger, how we can get into this reflective mode without losing ourselves. And Stephen M Rosen in modern postmodernism, I would say, and I wouldn't include Derrida there, but that's another thing. There is a big problem because we're not being able to be reflective. It's an either-or situation. If we're being reflective, that has to be cast in the material of the objective, and even our brain is supposed to be made of objective material. Neutrons, neutrinos, molecules, neurons, and you name it. I would say that's a matter of speaking, and I think they have a communal origin, and it stems from how space is actually constructed, not an image of space. This nonsensical three-dimensional academic notion from the Cartesian coordinate, it kills thinking, actually kills thinking, because that's a pre-reflective notion of space that is deep in the roots of common speak. It is rustic, it's not very smart, it's always assumed by everyone, bar no one, and it's brought into the institution, it's brought into books and everything, never pondered about, and that makes for the nullification. And that was something I, for the first time in my life, really realized when I read the book The Taint of the Mirror by Rodolphe Gasquet. It was actually in Prague. And I remember that instant. It was very personal because Marriott Tower next to me, where some very interesting artifacts and relics are still preserved to this day. And that was actually the place where the Silver Bible used to be, that was wrought by our Swedes in the 30th War. And the clock chimed in the moment I got it, so to speak. That doesn't happen often. Usually, and also this I would say, is the effect of very hard work under a long time, something that is so seldom done by academia today. The reason being, there is no gain. As he showed, Stephen M Rosen, nullification always happens. If you post anything, like, it's always in the term of a negative, an attack, a criticism. That obviously nullifies itself. and it never ever reaches outside the corridors of academia, but not even there it plays any role. And I think that could be helped by this. Understanding dimensions is the clue, because we are part of reality, and that used to be the case too. Three good reasons to change your way. Well, I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.